Thank you so much for that intro. Thank you. Did you want to introduce us?
I don't.
Yeah.
See, the whole thing is this whole poet laureate is this position is just the opposite of Emily Dickinson's ethos. So it's very strange. Um, we had some prepared questions that we were going to ask each other, and I think I'll go ahead and start. First question, and my phone closed. My first question is, what prompted you to apply for your poet laureate position?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so actually, I was nominated to apply to be Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That's kind of the way that they work. It's based off a nomination system, and people in the community can nominate you to be Poet Laureate, and then once you're nominated by someone in the community, you can then apply for the position. And I was actually new to Portsmouth. I had just moved in 2020, and at this point, it was 2022. So I'd only been living in Portsmouth for 2 years, but I had just met a lot of people within the community. There's a beat poetry community there, and I just happened to be at the right place at the right time with the right people, and I met just former poet laureates. I met other poets in the community as well, and just started to like make a name for myself, and then. Once I applied, I I knew that it would be a challenge because I knew that I would, if I did get the post, I would be the first person of color to receive the title, and it's really difficult being the first of anything. Um, there are a lot of expectations. I think I was told that I was going to shake things up. And I was like, well, yes, and also it's not my responsibility to shake everything up, but I feel really honored to have gotten the position and to have been doing that type of work in the community for those 2 years. So, same question to you, Oliver.
Back at me. So the Worcester Poet Laureate position, similar. You could yourself, as a poet, apply for the position, but I was also nominated, and I was rather reluctant to apply for the position because I feel sort of like an imposter in a way. This is year number 8 of me living in Worcester, and when I had applied, it would be year number 6. So I was definitely a transplant, and I felt a little apprehensive about taking on the position. The Worcester Poet Laureate position, there had been 2 other Worcester Poet Laureates prior to me, and they all went through this process of applying through the city. It's basically a position run through the city, namely the Worcester County Cultural Coalition manages arts programming, etc. And so what ends up happening is you have to submit a packet of your poems and a reason why you want this particular position or what kind of programming you're going to develop in that particular position. So the nomination process kicked me into going ahead and applying. Otherwise, I don't think I would have done it on my own merit.
Yeah, similarly, I don't think that I would have sought it out. I think, considering the type of poems that I write,
Yep.
I didn't think that I would be qualified to be a poet of the public. A lot of my poems deal with kind of difficult topics, mental illness. That's a big one. And just being a survivor of many things. So I didn't think that, these are the types of poems that they're going to want to hear from a potential, poet laureate. But when I submitted my poems for the packet, those were the poems that I submitted. So they knew what they were getting into when they chose me as poet laureate.
Yeah. No, same thing. I mean, I tend to write about political violence. I write about grotesque things and troubling things often. And I felt I'm not a fit for this position, which is, public facing, outward facing. And so I thought that they had made a mistake when they nominated me. I was like, sure about this? But I too submitted the work that I do, which is work that talks about political violence and identity. And I think that that was actually what had attracted them to me as a candidate, because Worcester is a city of immigrants and a city of people who have a number of stories. And I think that they saw value in what it is that I do.
I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about like what is a poet laureate? Like, what is that? What does that mean? Because I get asked that question all the time. Like, what is a poet laureate? Yeah, what do you think, Oliver, is a poet laureate?
She queued me up for the slide. She reminded me, it's like, hey, you need to put that slide.
We're a good team. This isn't the first time we've done things like this before. We're a good
That's
team.
a great question. So I always imagine the poet laureate, in my capacity of understanding this position, as, again, a public-facing position. And part of your job as a poet laureate, because it is a job, is to champion poetry. I also see the role as you are somebody who is a literacy and literature advocate. So in a lot of ways, a lot of what I do is advocating for funding for programs like, reading programs, youth programs, et cetera, that center learning and literacy.
Yeah, I love that answer. That's great. I've always considered it to be something along the lines of like a poet laureate is an ambassador to poetry within the community. And it just so happened that, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I feel like not only is it important to engage the community in poetry, but also use poetry as a way to connect other efforts within the community. I keep saying the word community a lot. I will. Don't you worry. But that's kind of how I feel about the Poet Laureate's duty. It's not just about literacy and poetry, but how can we connect poetry to some of the kind of like greater causes within the kind of the region.
Do you think being poet laureate has affected how you write? Just out of curiosity, has it affected the kinds of things that you write about, or the kind of lens that you view the world with?
Yeah, so we'll talk about this too a little bit more, but I actually am not a poet laureate who has to write occasional poems. I don't write any poems for specific events. And
so unfair.
I'm sure that I could have done it, but I think that, again, like they knew what they were getting into when they picked me as poet laureate. So I just bring my full, authentic self to every event, and I read what I can. I go through my poems and try to decide what's going to fit for this audience. And if something of mine doesn't fit for the audience, then I'll choose someone else's poem and read it at an event. I've read, some of Lucille Clifton's work, some of Ada Lamone's. I've done things like that where I can kind of introduce the public to other poets as well, ones that I really admire. So that's something that I've done instead of showcasing my own work when I feel like my work doesn't quite meet the criteria for an event. As far as things that, if I've changed the way that I write necessarily, I think being a poet laureate does take a lot of time, and it's time commitment. And that means that I'm not getting as much time for myself to write, not getting enough time in front of the page. And that's something that I noticed when I became poet laureate, that there were fewer and fewer poems in my Google Docs where I keep everything, so that was a little bit difficult for me. But same question for you, Oliver.
So I have to write occasional poems. And in fact, when I agreed to the position, there's kind of a contract that I had to sign. Yeah.
Ooh.
And the contract basically says, this is again from the Worcester County or Cultural Coalition, you have to write 4 poems annually for public display and county and cultural coalition use. So Yeah, so I'm basically writing these poems for specific occasions. So I had to write a poem for for the inauguration of the city planner.
Oh.
That was a hell of a poem. I had to write a poem for my own inauguration, which is easy enough. I have to write a Christmas poem, had to. And then every once in a while, there's like a summer event. So there was a festival of the arts in Worcester's City Square, and I had to write a poem about that. And that was only year one. And so here I am, middle of year two. I have a Christmas poem coming up that I have to write, and a couple of other things that I have to write. So every once in a while, the city, they have basically, I have a call sheet that the city tracks. And so if people are interested in the services of the Poet Laureate, they put in a petition that they're interested in having me speak. And then the Cultural Coalition notifies me that I have a hit. You have a hit. Go see if this is something that you can do. And so then I check the roster of events that are listed for me, and I determine whether or not this is something I can do. And sometimes it's write a poem or show up for this event. I just finished, let's see, the 181st meeting of the Mechanics Hall Board of Trustees or something like that. I read a poem for that. They were dedicating 3 paintings in their hall. One was of Frederick Douglass, one was of Sojourner Truth, and then I can't remember who the other painting was, but I had to write a poem about that. So I don't know how it is that you got away scot-free without having to write dedicated poems, but I'm pretty upset at this moment. I mean, and I would say this, that has it affected how I write? Yes. It has changed how I write because I am a little bit more cognizant of who I'm writing for and the audience for each specific poem. So like there's my literary audience who I write for most often. And then there's Worcester. And when I'm writing for Worcester, I have to think about what are the kinds of gestures that would be appreciated by a broader audience. So I zoom out about 1,000 feet and I figure, okay, who's going to be in the audience? Who's going to be hearing these kinds of things? Are there going to be children? What is the collective's experience with poetry? And I think accordingly.
Yeah. I do like though how you have a kind of like system of how they contact you for your services, which is definitely different from how I was contacted for services. It was definitely like emails upon emails, like in my inbox, and just having to kind of like filter through those and see like what opportunities made sense for me to take, and then which other ones, I just couldn't do because of time, or also just didn't really, I feel like, fit for me. I was asked to read a poem at the opening of a skate park, and I was like, I don't know if that fits for me. I don't know. As cool as it sounded.
I would do that.
See, maybe we can like switch. You can do some of you could have done some of my duties, and I can do some of yours. Yeah, absolutely.
The city of Worcester is now in the process of developing a gigantic spotlight that basically shines the shape of a pen into the skyline. And if I see that, then they know I have to write a poem.
We are kind of like superheroes.
Always.
Yeah, I think, when we're needed, we're there.
Yeah, I mean, people see me in Trader Joe's and they have no idea that I'm the Poet Laureate of Worcester.
See, I have
kind of go about my day. It's like, who's that man buying tomatoes? That's the Poet Laureate of Worcester.
See, I get noticed because I live in a relatively small city. I get noticed all the time. So when I'm buying tomatoes in my pajamas, that's when someone says, "Aren't you the Poet Laureate?" I'm like, I was.
And so the thing that being the second largest city in New England grants me is relative anonymity. So I don't get spotted that often. If I do, it's probably somebody who's already in the arts and artistic circles, but it's fairly uncommon.
I mean, I can joke around and say that like I'm the mayor of Portsmouth because everyone seems to like know who I am.
How big is
And
Portsmouth?
sorry, say that again.
How big is Portsmouth?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not sure,
That's
but it's.
stuff that poet laureates should know.
I know, but I'm not poet laureate anymore, so it's okay.
Okay, no, so you're off the hook.
They've grown in 2 years. The numbers wouldn't be accurate anyways. But yeah, why don't we talk a little bit about our poet laureate projects?
Yeah.
Should we?
So for the context of the poet laureate positions, oftentimes what they ask you to do in your application is to describe a project that you're going to do for the city. And each of us came up with projects. And I want to say, first and foremost, that a lot of these projects were funded by grants, specifically the Academy of American Poets gives out a very, very generous grant that you have to apply for, that you have to compete for. And it is funded through the Mellon Foundation. And basically, they give you a stipend to help fund your own life and living, but also they ask you to dedicate a portion of the money or the funds for your project. And so both Diannely and I were recipients of this fellowship, and we used our funds to develop these projects. So you want to go ahead and start and tell us a little bit about your project?
Yeah, absolutely. So my proposed project, and this was actually before I got the fellowship, because once I received the fellowship, the project became much larger. But initially, I proposed to create a podcast, and I called it the Bread and Poetry Podcast. And I actually just learned yesterday that Emily Dickinson actually made all of the bread that her family ate. So every day Emily Dickinson was making bread, and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Bread and poetry, absolutely. But why don't we play the trailer for the podcast? Let's do that. And you'll get a little bit of an intro. Hey there, folks. This is Diannely Antigua, Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Poet Laureate of your hearts, and host of the new podcast, Bread and Poetry. This podcast is about, you guessed it, bread and poetry. I was inspired by the poem, Like You, by Roque Dalton for both the title and mission of this podcast. My favorite line of the poem reads, I believe the world is beautiful, and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. So, in this podcast, I will be bringing poetry to the people, poets and non-poets alike. From artists to baristas, I'll be interviewing folks from all different walks of life about poetry and what it means to them. My goal is to demystify poetry, make it truly accessible to all in a way that nourishes the soul. I'll also be talking about bread, favorite types of bread, memories around bread, just lots of bread. Who doesn't love bread? Similarly, who doesn't love poetry? So follow us on Instagram at Bread and Poetry Podcast and Twitter at Bread Poetry Pod to keep in the know. This podcast is sponsored by the Portsmouth Poet Laureate Program. Follow them on Instagram at PPLPNH and visit their website at pplp.org. Please consider making a donation to fund future endeavors to engage the community in the transformative art that is poetry. The music for this podcast is by Stu Diaz. Stay tuned for episodes of Bread and Poetry coming at you this summer on both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Until then, my dear ones.
That's cool.
Yeah, so that was the trailer of the podcast when I first started, um, 2 years ago. And when I first started the podcast, I knew nothing about podcasting. The program purchased the equipment for me, but I had to learn how to edit podcasts. I had no idea how to do it, but it was a new skill that I was learning. Um, but really, my goal for the podcast was to demystify poetry and make it accessible to people. I think there's often this feeling that poetry is something that must be decoded and that it's like this secret message hidden. I mean, sometimes. However, I really wanted to bring poetry to the people and talk to people who weren't necessarily published poets, but who wanted to talk to me about poetry. And some of those people were just those within the community. Some of them were bakers. Some of them were, food service workers. Really, just anyone that wanted to talk to me about bread and poetry. I was very excited to do that. But I also got to interview some really amazing poets as well. And we'll do that one. And then actually, I want to talk slightly about the format of the poetry real quick, of the podcast real quick. So the podcast, we have different segments. We first talk about the guest's favorite type of bread, a memory around bread. They bring in a poem by someone else, and then they bring in a poem that they themselves have written. And then finally, we have the gluten-free segment of the podcast, which is a writing prompt, and it's a little morsel where anyone can indulge in them. Even if you are on a gluten-free diet, you can indulge in the writing prompt of the podcast. But everything from the theme music to the cover photo, I really wanted to incorporate people that lived within the community, especially marginalized voices. The cover photo and the theme music are both from artists of color. So that was really important to me, especially within New Hampshire, that is a very like homogenous region of the country. So I wanted to make sure that I was that I was uplifting marginalized voices. Ooh. No, we do not want to be marginalized. Not at all. But one of my favorite guests, my most recent episode was with John Murillo. And here he's talking a little bit about the basketball and poetry and how those relate.
When we talk about community, when you think about the communal function of poetry, right, what it can do, the way it can bring people together, basketball, I think, has that power as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so in that episode, we talked about no knead bread, and then we also talked about lob passes, which I learned then what a lob pass is, but I don't remember what it is now. It's a basketball term. I know nothing about basketball. But we had a great time chatting about bread, and then he brought in some poems that were about basketball, and we just connected all those things together. But it was just really interesting to see how conversations about bread could really open the door to vulnerability.
It's amazing. And so, why did you decide on? Well, I'm curious about the bread. Like, so you decided, okay, we're going to talk about these two things. Was it just like the idea of things that were essential or vital that sort of came about?
Absolutely. As I mentioned in the trailer, I was inspired by the poem "Like You" by Roque Dalton, and I do feel that bread is foundational to any diet. Food is foundational, sustenance, and I felt like isn't poetry kind of the same thing? At least for me, I feel like it has sustained me. It has helped me survive and live, and I wanted to present poetry in that same manner as sustenance, as opposed to, again, something that feels like it's only for the elite, but I wanted it to truly be for everyone.
Have you ever had in-person guests like in front of you and actually shared bread?
No, we didn't share bread, but I I keep thinking about like the future of the podcast and how it'd be really fun to actually like eat bread together.
Great.
Granted, I don't know if everyone's going to want to hear all the mouth noises that we make while we eat bread.
ASMR.
I know, right? That's a new thing.
People love it.
Yeah, yeah. But it's really fun to hear about people's stories, their favorite type of bread, and then a powerful or beautiful, challenging memory about bread. And like we always end up somewhere I never expected. And I just love that surprise of learning their favorite bread and then seeing where we end up.
So 2 years in, you've probably collected a lot of poems, right?
Yes, yes.
And
So
you up?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, when I started the podcast, I really wanted to showcase poems that were inspired by the podcast. So listeners were invited to submit poems that were inspired by the podcasts, especially the gluten-free segment of the podcast. We compiled it into an anthology called the Bread and Poetry Anthology. And it was just a fun project to edit and put together. And people in the community and even people who didn't live in Portsmouth also submitted poems, and it was lovely to be able to see them all together. And it was just a wonderful way to end my term as Poet Laureate, was to compile the anthology.
Yeah, it's incredible. And how big was the reach of your podcast? I mean, I know that you're on Spotify. I know that you're on Apple iTunes podcasts. Do you have any sense of how many folks were listening to you?
I don't have a sense of how many, but I do know that, when I would go to conferences, for example, like the AWP conferences, people would come up to me and be like, "Oh, I love your podcast," and I had no idea who they were. Like people from all over, the states, and it was incredible to see and witness the reach of the podcast, even though I, kind of didn't have an idea of how many people I was reaching at the time.
Incredible. And so, there we go.
Yeah. So once I got the fellowship from the Academy of American Poets, I ended up extending the project to have greater reach. And I developed the Bread and Poetry Project. And it's a 3-part approach to honoring the past, the present, and future of poetry's role in our communities. So it seeks to uplift the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program, the Bread and Poetry podcast, and then most importantly for me was the local organizations that I partnered with. One of them was Haven, that supports survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse, and then also NH Panther with their mission to end racism and systemic biases within the New Hampshire area. So I partnered with those organizations at fundraising events. We did some different poetry programming with NH Panther. We developed the Love and Resistance Poetry and Conversation series, and we brought those to different libraries. We actually went to Nashua Public Library and did a talk that highlighted Black voices. We did one with a local Mexican restaurant on Day of the Dead that highlighted Latinx poets, and the local Mexican restaurant provided food for everyone. So it was a great way to just bring the community together. And with Haven, I was helping them at different fundraising events, reading my poetry as a survivor, and also working with their clients who are survivors and teaching them about poetry.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So I'm going to talk about my project.
Yes, tell us. I've been talking for a long time. It's your turn,
And
Oliver.
you have. So I was working in support of an organization. The Worcester County Poetry Association had a project called Rain Poetry on its books for some time, but I think one of the things that I saw with the project was it was very insular, that basically the people who were publishing their poems for the Rain Poetry Project were mostly members of the WCPA, so it wasn't extending beyond the community. And so I applied for the Academy of American Poets fellowship, and I explicitly said that my plan was to open this up so that it would include K through 12, that it would be more inclusive of the public schools, and that from this particular initiative, the project would expand and hopefully become a legacy project for the organization in conjunction with the schools, right? So essentially what this entails, and you can kind of see the end product here where you see the poem sort of appearing from the sidewalk, the wet sidewalk. And so what happens, and that's me, is we get these stencils made through the company. We pay for them to sort of create the poems on these very pliable pieces of plastic. And they come out like these white sheets. And as you can see, we have to poke out the letters individually for each poem. And so we make a big celebration of this. We basically have a whole bunch of the participants or the folks who have written their poems come out and poke letters out with us, right? And so it becomes a really great, wonderful community event. And my tool was I had a little screwdriver that I just kind of like jabbed the letters with. And again, the idea was that I wanted this project to move from an insular project, which, you know, as I had mentioned, it was mostly held within the WCPA community. And I wanted to extend it beyond so that it would include a broader swath of the Worcester public. And so this is Catherine Anderson. She's sort of the head person or the point person of the project, and her daughter. And she was very helpful with sort of stirring up a lot of the community to mobilize and provide, you know, she provided a lot of the institutional knowledge for the project. So in a lot of ways, she was definitely my right-hand person in this. And here is a poem from a first grader, and they are basically with their mom, and she's really excited. She was super excited to be a part of this with her kid. And they are spraying the poem on the grounds of their school. And so when it rains, the poem will emerge, and they will see the poem from Carmen up here on the sidewalk.
So it's only when it rains that you can see the poem?
If the sidewalk gets wet, and the paint itself lasts 3 to 4 months. Wow. So it'll be on that sidewalk, and it'll emerge from the sidewalk whenever it rains, whenever it gets wet. And the other thing that I want to add is that you don't have to just submit your poems in English. Worcester has a number of languages that are being used, and so a lot of folks submitted poems that were in other languages. We had poems in Swahili. We had poems in Spanish. A lot of poems in Spanish. Some poems in French, and we would print out the stencils in that language that they preferred, and we would stencil them. This is a flyer for our submissions. And this is a poem by Paul Slozak. You can see it sort of appearing or emerging from the sidewalk. It's rained. And basically, we got about, I want to say, 80 to 90 participants in this, which was really, really wonderful. But before, it was like maybe 12, 13, 15. It was smaller. So, you know, the initiative to include the schools was really something special. I'm going to play a movie. It's going to require me to get out of this. And this particular movie is created by Ben Berman, who filmed some of the goings-on. Or Ben Oliver, I'm sorry, Ben Oliver.
It was myself and a few other judges that sat down this year to decide, you know, what screams rain, what screams sidewalk, what screams Worcester, what's going to make folks that are like waiting for a bus, that are experiencing a really dreary day in the city, look down and say, oh my gosh, that's really cool. I'm glad I live here. And what a cool piece of art.
My sister is a poet, so she suffers from MS. And I said, well, why don't you write a poem about the good side of aging? So she did, and about the same time I'd seen this notice about the rain poetry. And I said, well, do you mind if I entered this? And we worked on it back and forth.
My poem is called Goldenrod. When I heard that it was going to be rain focused, I sort of thought about how I felt when I was a kid when it would rain, and it's kind of like that mystical sort of aura kind of, and it kind of was when I felt like, weirdly enough, I was most creative. So this is kind of a poem about how when it rains, kids really get out there and they start creating their own little worlds, basically.
Initially, I started writing poetry that I felt kind of liberated myself. A couple years later, I was diagnosed with AML leukemia, and so I felt like poetry kind of gave me a way to alleviate some of the stress associated with that journey and pour it into a productive and artful, I guess, byproduct, if you will.
I was born and raised in Worcester, Massachusetts, and they told me that when they said rain, the first thing I thought about was death, unfortunately, and all of the friends that I'd lost in the city. So that's what inspired this, was a tribute to those that have died in the city.
So our poem is called Aging in Place, and it was also a reference to Worcester and the art community because there's so much here. The collaboration between my sister and I, she is a published poet out in California. She's really excited that she can say she's a published poet on both coasts now.
So my poem, titled The Divine Voices of Worcester, it was an autobiography in a sense, coming from Worcester and looking around and observing the hardship that people face, yet the resilience that people move forward with. I really wanted to write a poem to highlight that spirit, and the spirit that so perfectly encapsulates the city of Worcester.
And it's called Goldenrod because it's just a beautiful plant, and I sort of envisioned a bunch of children underneath the goldenrod, safe from the rain, creating their own little worlds, basically.
Ephemeral is the word we like using, which means that it's not going to last forever, which I think makes it a really exciting type of art.
And when we think about ephemeral things, they're typically the things that we care about the most, special moments, people, memories, things that are going to be there tomorrow. Most of all, I want to capture the sense that the spirit of Worcester isn't ephemeral, and it breaks the cycle of the poem itself, and that it'll be there long after my poem diminishes, long after my work is relevant.
I'll say a couple things. Again, Benjamin Oliver put together the video, and I want to add that among the things that the fellowship from the Academy of American Poets funded was, in my application for it, I basically stated that I wanted to create an archive of the events, and so we hired Benjamin Oliver to do the filming. We also plan on creating an anthology in a similar way, where this project had been in effect for about 3 years or 2 years prior to my involvement in it. And they have no record of what went on because those were COVID years. And so they wanted to commemorate the folks who couldn't go out and see their work being spray painted, etc. It was basically we were stuck indoors. So the Worcester County Poetry Association, in conjunction with myself, we want to put together an anthology where we celebrate all of the poems that had been published over the years for the project.
That's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing all of that. What do you feel like you've learned from this work? I mean, you're not done your term yet, but what do you feel you've learned from being a poet laureate?
Number of things. One, I've learned my city pretty well, right? I've learned how to get along in some of the various unnavigable places of the city, if that makes sense. the city is really an interesting and fascinating study in the haves and have-nots. And a lot of the city is basically bifurcated or segregated by the interstate. And these are things that I'm learning, and these are things that I've discovered as I was navigating all the various streets of the city, seeing sort of how a city can also be isolating, and how a city is indeed something that creates impediment. And my role as the Poet Laureate is to find ways to move beyond the impediments, maybe move some structures away so that people can access things like art, things like those kinds of activities. Other things that I've learned that sometimes you're not important. Like sometimes you're just there to introduce the city planner. And sometimes that's okay. But I also understand that in those moments where really you're not the main show, you have to sort of take that opportunity and give poetry to people who just aren't necessarily prepared for it. And so I think that part of the role of Poet Laureate, and specifically Poet Laureate of a city the size of Worcester, is to give poems to people whether they are ready for them or not, right? To sort of make poems be the thing that people will talk about at the end of, say, the city planner's planning meeting, right? I like to be sort of the unacknowledged legislator, if you will, thanks to Keats, right? How about you? What did you learn?
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot. Thinking about the public versus private spheres, I'm thinking that for me, I feel like I learned that it's okay to bring my poetry about things that feel like very taboo within the public sphere, and that in itself was a service. I think that it's really important to talk about mental illness and domestic violence and sexual abuse. Those are all things that we should be talking about, as opposed to having to censor ourselves. Because, once I did a lot of those events, I would often get folks who would come up to me afterward and say, like, wow, like I really needed to hear, this poem. This was really important to me, because now it's made me feel like I can, really tap into something about my own experiences. And I feel like this is kind of like a turning point for me. And I kept hearing that time and time again from different people. And I realized, like, yeah, sure, like my podcast, like, great, all of that work was wonderful. But I think it was those moments that felt like the most like valuable to me as far as like my term. Those were the moments that meant the most to me, was when I was helping someone just kind of realize or come to a moment of their own. Yeah, I thought that was something that I learned over time that was really important part of my work. Also, I think that having the position of Poet Laureate brought me into partnership with a lot of organizations that I wouldn't have known of otherwise. And even though I'm not Poet Laureate anymore, those partnerships continue. And I realized that one of the things that I always wanted to do, and I didn't know it until I was Poet Laureate, was being able to partner with organizations and using poetry as a method of bringing healing to the community. And I didn't know that that was even possible. I didn't know that that was a thing that I could do. And I think I often felt like my role was going to be one of just writing poems in my room, and I didn't realize that, again, like those poems that I was writing alone in my room were poems that people needed to hear out loud in, let's say like a tent on, Emily Dickinson's grounds, So, yeah.
Yeah, you never know who's in the audience, right? And you never know who's listening. And I think that that's one of the other things that was a delight to discover in this role of Poet Laureate. And you brought up some really important key things that I too have made lots of partnerships with local arts organizations in the city that I would have otherwise not been in contact with. And I, I think that the city that I'm in is sort of in a resurgence. It's really, really actively promoting the arts, but mostly those arts that they're promoting are visual arts. And so my role as Poet Laureate is like, let's kind of push you towards this to also include the literary arts, which are just as essential and just as vibrant. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Did you want to do those last?
No, we'll do that last.
Okay. Yeah. So we're open to any questions that you might have in the audience, whether you're here under the tent or virtual. We're open to your questions. And I think someone has a mic. Yes.
Yes. I can bring the mic around if people have questions here. Yes.
So I have a question about so how free are you as a poet laureate to experiment with poetry in different forms with the assignments you have?
So I often take great liberties with the assignments that I'm giving. Mostly, they basically give you just sort of a broad or general assignment. It's like, okay, so the themes of this particular event are X, Y, and Z. So I have to write around a particular kind of thematic or tonal idea, but they don't tell me what I have to, like in terms of the subject, what I have to hit on. They just want maybe one or two Worcester landmarks in there somehow. So I can write about, I often what I do is I write about my kids and their experiences in the city. And I think that's always a good way for me to sort of channel a level of expressiveness and wonder, if I look at the city from the angle of my children. Yeah. But generally, they're not too strict about what they're expecting in terms of the poem.
Thank you both so much. I'm curious if you could each share who and what has inspired you the most in your lives.
Wow, the most in my life. I think what has most inspired me in my life are the women in my family. We're all survivors of many things, and we're all carrying that, and we all carry it very differently. And a lot of us are artists, visual artists. My grandmother was a baker. My mom was a baker. And I have cousins who are painters and sculptors, and we all explore our own survival in those ways. But most importantly, I think my inspiration has always been my grandmother, who passed away in 2012. And she is the reason I think that I'm a poet. She was the first storyteller that I encountered. She would tell her little cuentos, her little stories, anytime I would visit her. And they were always the same stories, too. She had this one story about an old couple who shared a pair of dentures, and they would know what each ate that day because because they shared a pair of dentures. And this was one of her funny stories that she would tell. And I loved that story. I loved it so much because she would do all the voices, and then she would take out her own dentures as part of it. And it was just so it was always just this whole performance, and I just so admired her ability to do that. And it was just I always wanted to hear that story. I never got sick and tired of hearing the story about the old couple who shared a pair of dentures. Never got tired of it. And I think that's how my relationship to poetry is too. I can read the same poem over and over and over again, and I never get tired of it. Put me in front of an Emily Dickinson poem, I won't get tired of it. Ada Limon, Sharon Olds, these women that I just admire so much. I won't get tired of poetry, just like I won't get tired of my grandmother's stories. So I think, I just carry that with me always. And I dedicated my first book of poetry to my grandmother. And I just feel really honored to have had her in my life.
For me, my touchstone is my father. And it's primarily because he was the one who taught me how to read. What he did was, and he basically was embarrassed about this, but I think that it was a very sort of telling story. He would borrow books from the library. This is back in the 70s. He would borrow books from the library, and he would record himself reading the books on a cassette recorder, which was also, back then we used dictaphones for medical transcription, and my mom was a doctor, and we had one of these dictaphones in the house. So he would borrow these books from the library for me and record himself reading. But really what he was doing was he was trying to rehearse ways to erase or eradicate his accent. And so on the dictaphone or the recorder, I would listen to stories of him in his English, his very accented Filipino or Tagalog accented English. And sometimes parts of the story would be erased because he would rewind it and erase it because he was uncomfortable with how he sounded. And, the fact that he would do this just showed me just a profound amount of love, that it was like, well, how can I capture that? How is it that I can sort of share with my sons who, are teenagers now, that there was a cost to coming here, a cost to a particular type of erasure of the self that my dad was sort of constantly rehearsing as he was trying to tell me the stories that he wanted me to learn. So that's my touchstone, that this particular moment where, my father and I would walk in on him sort of in the morning when he was rehearsing this, he was recording these stories, and being unsatisfied with just how he sounded, erasing over those stories and recording them over again. And who's to tell my kids about that? Me. And so in a lot of ways, that particular touchstone, the need to tell my sons the story of their grandfather, who they're frankly annoyed by him every once in a while. They're like, oh, he's so frustrating, he's annoying. It's like, yeah, he is, and he can be. He's very human, but he loves you, and he loves you unconditionally. And there's no other way to tell you this but through the stories and the poems that I write. So, I think that's my touchstone. That's my touchstone. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from someone in our online audience, and just so you know, and those of you here under the tent, there are at least 80 people who are with you online, which is just a tremendous, that's just wonderful. But one of them asks about you, you both spoke about feeling uncertain whether there was a place for you in the poetry world and in the realm of Poets Laureate. And you've both done these wonderful projects that have sort of created that space for you. And the question is, are there kinds of poetry or kinds of poets that you would like to see more represented in these roles?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think I'm going to speak specifically about Portsmouth and Portsmouth Poet Laureate program. And I would definitely like to see more poets of color in this position. I was the first person of color. I hope I'm not the last, and I know Oliver and I were having that conversation earlier. And my hope is that the work that I've done, the legacy that I've created won't end with me, that I think for me that would be the most heartbreaking thing, is if I am the only poet of color that they have after a while. And I would love to see more folks of marginalized identities be a poet laureate, especially those with, disabilities, visible or invisible. That's, another identity that I hold that people don't see as someone who is non-able-bodied. So I would like to see, just more marginalized folks being able to become poet laureate as well.
So the position of Poet Laureate at Boston, the applications are, they're looking for applications. And the deadline for the Boston Poet Laureate is October 11th, midnight. So that's just kind of a heads up. In terms of the question, just sort of to address that, one, I would love to see a Massachusetts Poet Laureate. Since we don't have a Massachusetts Poet Laureate, we mostly have like cities and county Poet Laureates. I think it's really weird considering how literary the state is. Why not? Why don't we have a Poet Laureate? The other thing that I want to see and that I'm really excited about is youth Poet Laureates. I think that that is a space to create aspirational goals for people who are younger, who are in love with poetry, right? That they will act or function as models for other poets, young poets out there. And I think that supporting those kinds of programs and those kinds of communities is something that we need to be doing. So one, let's get a Poet Laureate for the state. Two, let's support these youth Poet Laureate programs that are out there.
Okay, I'll just look for other questions in the audience under the tent, but also a couple more online. The projects that you've described to us are just fabulous in putting, in building community, actually sharing your work sort of on, with people directly, face to face. What other projects did you consider prior to fixing on these? Were there others that you were thinking about?
No. For me, no. The answer is no. I think I was very much set on the podcast. I've always wanted to host a podcast, and I think I just wasn't sure on what the overall theme was going to be. I think when I first considered podcasting, I thought that it was going to be a sad girl podcast, which, I can still do that, talking about mental illness, but in a way, I kind of got to do that anyways with the Bread and Poetry podcast because of all the vulnerable places that we end up going in each episode. I can't tell you how many times I've interviewed folks and we've both, been tearing up, almost every single episode that I've recorded. Some of us in person recording, some of us on Zoom and tearing up. We really just go to vulnerable places. So I think I knew when I applied, I was like, this is my chance to do that thing that I've always wanted to do, and it's a podcast. And then I think what came later with the Bread and Poetry project, that just kind of felt like an extension of what I had already created. So I think I was pretty set on the project to begin with, but I'm curious about you, Oliver, if you had any other thoughts.
Yeah, so actually when I applied, I didn't apply for having the Rain Poetry Project as my signature project. Rather, what I wanted to do was I wanted to, so basically what had happened was COVID, and there was lined up in the city of Worcester a literary festival. That went away, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to serve as the Poet Laureate in support or in promotion of a literary festival in the city. I still have aspirations of doing that, but I think my scale has gotten a little smaller. So I'm really interested in this idea of legacy programming or programming that stays with the city and maybe with the Poet Laureate position, like a collaboration with the New England Botanical Garden for a reading series, for example, or various reading series in other public venues of the city. I still have one more year on my tenure and plenty of time to sort of plan those things out.
I love the idea that you brought up of bringing poetry to people, whether they're ready or not, and also maybe whether you're ready or not. And I'm curious if there are moments in your experience or daily practices where you also help people get ready to move poetry from being private to being public.
I did host several poetry workshops throughout my term. It was every April for National Poetry Month. I hosted poetry workshops at the library, the public library, and then once I did the Bread and Poetry Project, another thing I did, which is I didn't even include it in the slide, was I also invited poets to run an online workshop, and it was free. It was a free online workshop that I offered to people, anyone, really. I would post it online, and no matter if you lived in Portsmouth or not, you could partake in this free poetry workshop. And I think, like, giving people the tools to write poems is in a way helping them potentially bring that to a more public setting, and and sharing their work, because then people feel more confident in that ability once you give them the tools to write. Yeah, I'd say that in that way, that's how at least I was able to do it.
Similar, that oftentimes the Worcester Public Library has workshops, and I've been invited a number of times to run workshops. Usually when I run them along thematic concerns. So when I ran the workshop over at Worcester this last time, I did it with the theme of obsession, or writing from obsession or through obsession, which is very similar to the haunting theme. Don't tell them, right? But I mean, I think that the medium is to conduct workshops in the classes and bring the poetry out to people, oftentimes people who are not familiar with. The other things that I've been doing, I will go to schools and I will run workshops. So a couple of the schools in the state, not just Worcester, in the state, have invited me to run workshops. And so I've done that.
Another online question was, did you try something as Poet Laureate that didn't work?
I've read to one person before. Actually, multiple times. But I mean, the show must go on, right? Like you have to perform, you have to read, whether you're reading to 1,000 or whether you're reading to one. And I think that one person who I read to on a couple of occasions came away from, the reading with some excitement and some new poems that they want to write. So you just never know, right? So that's one of the things that happened. Mostly that. It's just like sometimes I just read to like basically very few people, and that's okay. I mean, it's part of the job, right? It's part of the gig.
Yeah, exactly. I think for me, like, not to say that I did something that didn't work, but it just maybe wasn't as I expected it every time. And especially with the podcast, there were hiccups along the way, considering the fact that I had never, edited a podcast before. I'm not a sound engineer, so it was definitely like a new skill, having to watch YouTube videos. And like the first few episodes of the podcast took forever to edit, like weeks and weeks just to edit one podcast episode. And then as time went on, I ended up learning how to be able to do it myself in a much shorter amount of time. But that was just like a learning curve for me, was just the technical things about it that had really nothing to do with the poetry of it. Just, yeah.
Let's see, another form of a question online is, what have you both learned from other poet laureates? And I imagine this means in the public role.
I learned how to fill out that application for that big grant. I had some really generous poets come, approach me and remind me that I need to get those fellowships in because they're really important and they can change the dynamics of what it is that you do. So, couple poets out there that just sort of gave me a shout out and just said, "Hey, you need to apply for this. It's really a big deal." The poet laureate of Salt Lake, or of Utah, Paisley Reckdahl, sent me a note. She said, you need to apply for this." And then the poet laureate of Indiana, then poet laureate of Indiana, Adrian Matika, did the same things, like, you need to apply for this. And then they basically just gave me pointers on how to, arrange the fellowship. So that's one thing. The other thing that folks told me, which was very useful, was think about maybe one project per year at the most. Like one project per year at the most. Otherwise, you're just doing too much. I think you're doing way too much. Because the poet laureate gets busy. Like, a poet laureate gets busy. There's a lot of things that are happening in a city like Worcester, and a lot of people, surprisingly, want your time, whether it be for the dedication of a building or the anniversary of a particular founding father of the city. I have a call sheet, like I had mentioned, that I often have to respond to. So in terms of the projects that you want to launch, you want to kind of keep it on the minimum.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think what I learned from other poet laureates, especially like the ones that were within my community, was just kind of like how to be poet laureate. What does it mean, at least within Portsmouth? The 11th poet laureate of Portsmouth, named Mike Nelson, he was really a guiding light to me as I just entered into this community that I was really new in. Like I said, I had just moved to Portsmouth, and I moved to Portsmouth in 2020. So really, I didn't know anyone until about 2021. So it was great to just have someone to guide me throughout that process of making connections with local organizations, who to contact. He had email addresses. So I think it's really important, and I think like what you've mentioned is just being able to rely on your colleagues, other poet laureates, for guidance, and that's something that you shouldn't be ashamed of, but you should see that as an opportunity and as a gift.
We have time for just a couple more questions, I think.
So this is kind of a pragmatic and boring question, but I'm curious, because I struggle with this, how you balance your public role, to the community as a poet laureate, or even when you're not, your own writing, and paying bills. So like, I have a day job, which is a really big day job because I'm a college professor, as are you, and it's really a challenge to make the time and have the energy for all those different pieces. So I'm always curious how people are managing it.
So my answer is, how I balance these things, and the answer is poorly. But I will say this, that first and foremost, my priority is always my family. Secondly, it's actually my job and my career. I sort of like triage, if you will. And then, sometimes there are things that you can say no to as a poet laureate. That's okay. I mean, I know that it might be a disappointment and that you want to sort of be out there for your public, but I also think that you are modeling what it means to be a poet citizen, and sometimes a poet citizen has to attend to their family or attend to their own craft. That said, as far as my own writing is concerned, I don't write as much during the year, and I just have to be okay with that. A lot of times, my writing picks up in the summer because the slate of activities for both my academic career and the poet laureate gig are low, right? Like, a lot of the arts programming has already been done, or they're more given to sort of outdoors activities that don't involve literary stuff. So I just tend to write in the summer. And that's mostly how I triaged. I prioritize family and my first job, and then the Poet Laureate stuff, I sort of figure out what my calendar looks like so that I can do something in a not low impact, but in a way that I can attend to it with my fullest of attention without having to be worrying about these other things.
Yeah, I liked how you said you balanced it poorly. I feel the same. I think, like, first and foremost for me, it was my mental health that was most important, because you do get asked to do a lot of different things. At least I did. And I really needed to think about, like, do I have the capacity for this? You know, how many events do I have this week? How many things do I have going on in my own life, my own personal life? When will I sleep? When will I be able to, you know, binge Gilmore Girls? Like, I need time for that. And all of that's, like, really, really important to just keeping myself healthy. And especially, you know, as I shared, as a non-able-bodied person, my capacity looks very different from someone else's capacity. So I have to, like, take that into account, especially when you know, I was asked to do a lot of things, and the people on the other end asking me expected that I would have the time and the capacity to do it. And I would have to be really honest with them and say, hey, you know, this is my situation, and I have to be really mindful about protecting my time and my health. So that was something that I learned, and that was challenging. And I think I'm still learning how to do that. I'm getting better at it, saying no. Because otherwise, like, I won't be able to continue to say yes if I don't say no to some of the things. And as far as, like, writing, I also shared that I didn't write as much when I was Poet Laureate, and I'm kind of, like, trying to pick that back up again. My term just ended in May, and then now I'm starting up, you know, the semester, and I teach as well. So, like, trying to figure out how to balance all of that. And then I think it's also important for people to know that sometimes you don't get paid for what you're doing, and sometimes you do. And sometimes the city pays a small stipend, or the town pays a small stipend, and sometimes they don't. It really just depends on your community, your region, your city, and what they have in place. You know, Portsmouth has a very, very small stipend for their Poet Laureate position. It's not something that, you know, would sustain anyone. It's not that type of thing. But one thing that I did learn, especially because I consider myself self-employed, a lot of the work that I do is gigs, appearances, is advocating for the honorarium, you know, and saying, hey, like, is there an honorarium for this? And especially as a poet of color and, you know, an artist of color, I think that's so important to advocate to be paid for your labor, for your work, for your art. And that, to me, is being an example to other poets of color, other artists of color, to also do the same, you know. I think that it was easy, or it could have been easy for me to just be so honored with the position and be like, I'm going to just do everything for free. But I can't survive that way. Like, I do need to eat and pay my bills, so it's important that my art be valued.
Thank you. I think one last question. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that have appeared in the Q&A. And this is sort of practical advice, pragmatic advice for a community that does not have a Poet Laureate, or a state, as you mentioned, Massachusetts doesn't. But let's say for a smaller community, what advice would you give for going about establishing that role? And then a sort of related thing that you've touched on is, you know, what are the models of private and public funding for Poets Laureate?
Wow. Models for private and public funding for poets. So I would say this, that oftentimes a city may have a small budget for arts funding, right? And oftentimes they don't spend all of that money. So on the one hand, you can sort of advocate for, say, a position for a Poet Laureate using a small allocation of those arts fundings. I think the argument that you're going to make to advocate for a Poet Laureate is that it is useful and beneficial to have somebody who serves as a figurehead for a literary community in your town, somebody who can enact programming that is public facing, that supports initiatives that maybe run through the public schools, maybe run through the K through 12. Having somebody who has experience and knowledge doing those things, literacy programming, is certainly something you can advocate for, and oftentimes a poet laureate is a good person for those kinds of advocacy models. In terms of private funding, you know, we already talked about the Academy of American Poets grant. There are other grants out there or other funds out there that, like, as poet laureate, you really, you know, you can't apply for. It's more of the organization has to apply for it, and you can support them by saying, here's how you apply for it, and this is the kind of language that you use, and here's how you would sort of work in that role. There are a number of ways that you can approach this, but I would say, first and foremost, advocate for serving as somebody who could provide literary programming or expand literacy in the K through 12.
Yeah, I think you kind of mentioned most of what I would have said. But also I think I would ask or add, talk to other cities and towns, states that have Poet Laureate programs established, just to get a better sense of, you know, what's needed in order to establish it in your own town. I know that the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program is a nonprofit. They're not connected to the city in any way. The city doesn't give them any money. But it was just a group of people who loved poetry and wanted to create the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program. So every, you know, Poet Laureate position looks a little bit different, and it started a little bit differently too. So depending on the avenue in which you start it, kind of changes things. So,
thank you. That's make sure I'm on. No wonder. No wonder. Thank you. Okay, just one question that has been on my mind for a few days. Are you all Poet Laureates or Poets Laureate?
Both. I mean, I think, like, grammatically correct, it's Poets Laureate. Do I say that? No.
Poet Laureates.
I'm fine with not being
Poets
grammatically correct.
Laureate.
You know, I live in that.
You
I
know,
dwell in possibility.
Yeah, I would also say that we are poets and we operate in the province of sound. Poet laureates or poets laureate? The second one sounds awful. I like the first one, yeah.
Okay.
So, like, if I'm writing my lines, man, that first one is what I'm going to put in the poem, not the second.
That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking Oliver and Diannely. This has been such a wonderful conversation about the relevance of poetry in the public sphere, bringing poetry to the community, and making poetry accessible. And the Emily Dickinson Museum is certainly inspired by what you've shared with us today. I also want to thank you for those tremendous readings yesterday.